Hello, listeners. This is Behind the Flicks. In his introduction to I Loved Movies, but Danny Perry writes that Joseph McBride, quote, inspired me. He also intimidated me. This was through no fault of his own. Even with all the praise I received, I never felt that I could come close to what Joe was doing. He remained the gold standard, the real deal. I can confirm that this is how I felt upon first meeting Joe, the former Daily Variety reporter who also collaborated with Orson Welles, as well as co wrote a comedy musical starring the Ramones. For someone with such a distinguished career, I did not expect him to be so generous and encouraging. Not only did I have the privilege of taking his course on Orson Welles at San Francisco State University, but I had the honor of being one of his teacher's assistants for a year. Joe McBride is back on the podcast to discuss his new book, I Loved Movies But, as well as one of Orson Welles' masterpieces, The Magnificent Ambersons. Joseph McBride, welcome back to Behind the Flicks.
Thank you. Well, it's very, very gratifying to hear all your comments, and I'm pleased to be able to talk to you about on the occasion of my new book, which is autobiographical. It's in a series that Paul Cronin, who's a very good film writer himself, has started a very innovative company called Sticking Place Books, and he's commissioned a lot of unusual esoteric film books that other publishers might not pick up, but they're all fascinating. And he started a series on interview books with well-known film critics and historians, and he has several already. Jonathan Rosenbaum, Jim Naramore, Michelle Simot, other people have contributed books already to the series. And my friend Jerry Perry has a new book that just came out, and his brother Danny, who's another old friend of mine from the Madison Film Mafia, we called it, from the University of Wisconsin. Paul said, I recommend asking somebody, you ask somebody to interview you for the book. And so I thought of Danny because he had interviewed me a couple times for a publication in New York on a couple of my other books. And I was very impressed by the depth of his questions and the ease with which we communicated. And we have that long history. So he and I talked from experience about certain events we were at, or things overlap.
You are such a magnificent writer that I was initially surprised that you decided to go for that. You were convinced to do a Q&A format as opposed to a traditional straight autobiography.
I think it's kind of a good way to do it. It's I mentioned that uh, it's kind of similar to what I've done over the years. I've interviewed many, many people. I estimate in my various careers as a journalist, and film historian and biographer, I've interviewed about 15,000 people, and many, many important film people. Because when I went to Hollywood, I made a point of looking up everybody I wanted to meet. And I was very fortunate to be in the right time and place when a lot of these legendary people were still around. So, I'd done so many interviews, it was a natural format, and it seemed like a fun way to do it.
What was it like being on the other side of the interview?
Well, that is interesting. In the recent years, I stopped writing biographies in 2001 when my John Ford biography, Searching for John Ford, was finished. Um, I can't afford to write biographies. They're too expensive because the advances you get are not sufficient to do the kind of work that I feel I have to do. I've been interviewed a lot since then, um, because when I did biographies, I'd interview hundreds of people. And that was the fun part of writing a biography, is traveling around meeting all kinds of great people, and people from the distant past, who could tell me about the world long before I was born. And I met people who were born in the 19th century who I interviewed, a lot of Capra's friends and
Oh, wow.
classmates. And it was Spielberg, since he's still alive. I was able to interview his teachers and Boy Scout leader and family friends who knew their family. And I interviewed his father, and it's just great, as well as all the kids who worked on his amateur films. That was the most interesting part of it. Billy Wilder said that Steven Spielberg was a great director when he was 10 years old.
Yeah.
And it's actually true. Spielberg started when he was 10, and he's been making films since 1957. It's a long, long time. And but all these young people who worked for him on his amateur films had great stories to tell, and almost all of them said to me, "Geez, I've been waiting for 30 years for the phone to ring or the doorbell to ring, and somebody to ask me about this, and nobody has."
Wow.
I mean, it's this great untold story about this kid who became a film fanatic when he was 10, and you saw it in the Fablemans, how he sort
Oh
of
yeah, yeah.
shows his development pretty well. Um, but there's so much to tell, and he did so many different kinds of films and experimented so much, and it was just wonderful to learn about this young artist developing, and also these, and like almost everybody I interviewed about Capra is dead now. You couldn't do that book again. Spielberg, a lot of them are fortunately still with us, but in years to come, that'll be even more precious, that kind of material. So I've been interviewing people. I interviewed people for the biographies, but not so much for the critical studies. I'd interview a few people here and there. So I've been interviewed more, is the point. I've been doing a lot of interviews for podcasts, which I love doing because you can have great discussions, and for blogs and things. And so I feel like I'm a little sad because as much as like being interviewed, I'm a good interviewer, and I kind of miss exercising that side of my personality.
You like the connection
Yeah,
and learning.
I like probing people, and when I was a young guy, I read about this, and I love movies, but I was a serious Catholic kid for a while until I broke from the church under great strain. But I wanted to be a priest, and I was serious about that for a while. My parents said, go to high school first and meet some girls, and then if you still want to be a priest, okay. So, of course, the minute I met a girl, I didn't want to be a priest anymore. Um, but I think I have this ability to get people to kind of confess, because part of it is just listening carefully and knowing what to ask and being sympathetic and getting people to confide. I've had some amazing confidences given to me by people I've interviewed who've kind of opened their hearts and minds to me. One other thing I'll say, I went to the University of Southern California once in 1971. We were shooting a scene for The Other Side of the Wind, the Welles film, and in the background there is a shot of me in the film. Um, Welles was shooting a scene in which the director character, later played by John Huston, is supposed to be talking to students. The scene didn't wind up in the film, but it was interesting. But um, actually, I remember when I was walking into the auditorium at 7 o'clock that night for this talk, um, I passed a professor who was starting a class, and I said, kind of presumptuously, I said, "Aren't you letting your students go hear Orson Welles talk in this other auditorium?" And he took offense and he said, "Well, when he learns to walk on water, maybe I'll let them do that." This is so typical of
Holy mackerel.
academia. Um, but anyway, so we went in there, and one of the students said, "How would you teach film?" And Wells said, "Well, first of all, I wouldn't show any films." And this kid said, well, everybody was kind of like confused. And Wells said, "You've seen enough films in your lifetime. And the kid said, "Well, what would you teach?" And Wells said, "I would teach the history of the world." I remember he put his arms out wide, and that's really good advice. When I was teaching at San Francisco State, you'll remember a lot of our students, cinema students, would complain because they had to take general education courses it's a university, it's not a trade school. And, I took history, sociology, other artistic subjects, chemistry, whatever. Um, and they would complain about this. And I said, well, these are the most important courses you take. And I'd quote Wells, because what are you going to make movies about if you don't have the knowledge of the world? And what distinguishes the early filmmaking greats is these people didn't come out of cinephilia, because there wasn't really such a thing in those days. They came out of other fields. Howard Hawks was an engineer, and Buster Keaton was a vaudeville
Vaudeville. Yeah.
vaudeville guy, and Jean Renoir was in the arts. And I mean, His father was a great painter, and he was an artist as well, a ceramist, ceramics. Um, Victor Fleming was a race car driver, and all these characters had different backgrounds and shows in their films. Truffaut said you can always tell in a director's work what his first job was, because they make movies that reflect their first job. And so that's, I think, good advice for young filmmakers. Study the history well, because one of the things that's wrong with a lot of filmmaking in America today is the films are takeoffs on other movies or TV shows, and they're not really about, grappling seriously with interesting subject matter. There's such a wealth of material out there to make movies about.
If I can go back for a moment, I want to relate this to me myself personally and my experience with you. The you talked a little bit about your early school days as well as your breakdown, and I'm I'm fine talking about this now about me. In the middle, it was about I want to say a year into doing this podcast, I had my own. I'd say I would say emotional breakdown
Mm,
personally,
mm,
and and I have to say I called you and you were very supportive of me, and I wanted to first of all say thank you. That to have somebody not only I don't even know how to say it, somebody who is such a great generous person as well as a great friend and a great um a, a a mentor to sort of talk to
mm,
means the world to me. And also, and I during my time in a psychiatric evaluation, I was diagnosed with autism.
mm.
Um, and you write this in the book. I hope it's okay for me to say you self-diagnosed with Asperger's, which is a form of autism, I believe.
Yeah, it's on what they call it on the spectrum.
On
Recently
the
I was
spectrum,
I
yeah.
was reading that even the term Asperger's syndrome is not often used diagnostically, but
Correct.
that's because it's on the spectrum. And I don't know, but I still think the term is useful because it's been around for quite a while. And
Yeah.
when you study it, you really understand um, what it means. I was very impressed that you were very open with me about your breakdown, and that's a very good sign that people can talk about it, because there's shame connected even now with mental health problems. There shouldn't be, because I mean, we all have some mental health issues, just, and some people have more than others, but
Yeah.
it's just like having a physical problem, and there's should be no shame in talking about it. But you were very open about it, and you were going through a tough period, but you were very self-analytical and very serious, and your parents were supportive, and I was glad to hear that. And I was glad to lend a friendly, understanding ear because I knew what you were going through. And um, the autism thing, I've never been studied for it, and I should, I suppose. But when it was around the year 2000, the New York Times ran a piece on autism, on Asperger's syndrome. And I thought, geez, now I understand what I was going through as a kid. I was treated as strange, when I was in grade school. That's why I was bullied so much, I think. And that's why these nuns, I could never understand why the third grade nun hated me. And I just think, I mean, I was somewhat rebellious. I wouldn't just kind of agree with them on everything. But I mean, I tried to fit in, but it was hopeless. When you have Asperger's syndrome, you can't really fake fitting in very well. I'm reading The Manchurian Candidate again, which is the novel I've read more than any other. This is the 11th time I've read it. And it's just a great, great book by Richard Condon. But one thing that struck me is the guy in there who's this brainwashed character, who's a military man who gets brainwashed. Um, he's very much like an autistic character.
Mm.
He doesn't show affect much, and he's strange behavior. People don't like him. They find him cold and withdrawn. These things that affect Asperger's people. And one of the points that Condon made was, he said, Raymond, the guy he would have to counterfeit emotions that people expected. When he was talking to people, he would remember, oh, I'm supposed to show
Yeah.
pleasure or anger or whatever, and then he would act it out. And that's very much what Asperger's people do, is you kind of remember that you're not showing what is considered appropriate responses. So you kind of have to remember to smile or whatever. I mean, actually, at San Francisco State, some of the criticism I got from students and faculty had to do with that syndrome, I think,
Mm.
I mean, it's bedeviled me my whole life. And one of the last things our chair said to me was, because some students were being critical of me. He said some students say that you make them feel they're stupid. And I said, well, I don't try to do that. But I mean, if somebody doesn't know a subject, I point out the facts or whatever. Anyway, I said to him, what advice would you give me about dealing with students like that? He said, be cheerful. And
Mm.
I had to laugh, but I could see that's a symptom of people reacting to an Asperger's type person. When I was in college, I mentioned this in the book. A student named Elaine Cohen wrote a feature on me for the Daily Cardinal, the UW school newspaper, and she said that my writing was quietly merry. And I
Mm.
thought that was a great description of my writing, that I have a quiet sense of humor that comes across in my writing, but it's not heavy-handed or obvious like some people's, foregrounding of humor. But anyway, back to, yeah, the Asperger's thing has influenced my life quite a lot, and I guess so. You feel you're kind of on the spectrum yourself, you think?
I have been told I'm on the spectrum, and based on your experiences as well as what I've heard, what the common symptoms of autism are, yeah, I am.
Well, I'm in some ways, see, I think I always believe in taking negative things and making positive things out of them. And, in life, we're all dealt kind of a mixed hand. And you can succumb to your problems or you can make hay out of them. And being an Asperger's kind of person is very good for a biographer, for example, or a writer of any kind, because I'm very meticulous about details and research. I'm a fanatical researcher, and that's what I think makes my books good. And that comes from Asperger's issue. But you have to keep it under control so it doesn't overwhelm your work or whatever. Um, but artists in general are people who have some problems, because why else would you become an artist? It's the old thing of the grain of sand in the oyster turns into a pearl, and that's what creates a work of art. So being on the spectrum can be actually a kind of a good thing, as long as, I mean, it does create some problems with your interpersonal relations, but you have to find friends and partners and all who are understanding, and some people are seriously autistic to the point where they can't talk or they're too withdrawn or whatever. And there are levels of problems, but I
It's a
think
spectrum.
I'm sort of mildly on the spectrum, and I think it's actually a good thing. And I think you are too, and that's a good thing for you. I can tell you're a serious, dedicated guy. And like when you make a film and I give a critique, you take the advice seriously. You're able to take advice.
So, in the last year and a half, I made one half-hour short film.
Mhm.
And I'm 28. You're in your 40s, I'm assuming. And
Well,
how
78, actually. You're very kind. Yeah.
I actually, in reality, I would not have guessed that.
Ah,
You look great.
well, thank you.
Um, so okay, so how many books have you released?
The new one here is number 26, coming out the 21st of November in Tick Book. I've done, well, let's see, the last 3 years.
Yeah, last 3 years. I have a reason for asking this question.
Well, in 2021, which was 4 years ago, I had four books that came out in a short period of time. And
In the same year.
uh, well, I think it was 2021, the beginning of 22, four books came out in a short space. I did a book on Billy Wilder. I did Political Truth. I did a book on the Coen brothers. I updated the John Ford book that Mike Wilmington and I did, and uh,
Four.
yeah, I've done some other ones. So I did a book on George Cukor in 2024. So I've been cranking out. I think I've averaged in my book writing life a book every 2 years, which is pretty good pace. But
O- Okay, my question is, where do you get your energy from? I'm exhausted making this half-hour short film.
yeah, I mean, making a film is a lot of work, and
Yeah, yeah, but the the quality of your work is incredible as well as the output. So where do you get that craft and quality from?
yeah, people ask me that question all the time, and I don't really quite know, except I'm very dedicated and I'm very disciplined. And I've been writing books since 1963. I started writing a book on baseball when I was in high school. I didn't know how to write a book, but I taught myself how to do it. I love doing it. That's part of the thing is I love working on books and I'm very efficient. I don't waste time. I mean, books can take years of work and I think about them for a long time before I plunge ahead and do it. I guess the short answer, I asked Truffaut once, who was a friend of mine, I said, how do you manage to be so prolific as a writer? And he said, write every day. It's very simple. If you write every day, which most people don't do, you will have a book by the end of the year. Um, Most people, they think, well, I'm not going to write till I'm in the mood, or if I have
Mm.
inspiration, that's just bullshit. Just sit down and write. Part of the trick is to write if you don't feel good, like if you're feeling kind of under the weather or tired or sick or whatever, just start writing and you'll feel better as time goes along, which is one of the good things about writing.
And I loved movies, but you described how you felt, quote, betrayed by the movies, unquote. Oh, end quote, excuse me. And that you have some anger and regrets. I have to admit that it does make me feel sad to hear that, because the high bar that you set for your work has set uh, a new standard for the rest of us.
Hmm.
The quality and the quantity of your work is something that any writer or artist in any medium would really should envy.
Hmm.
So I'd like to hone in a little more on as to what you mean by feeling betrayed. Do you feel betrayed by the people who are in power in the movie business or in the artistic process?
Well, yeah, I mean, I say that at the very end of I Love Movies, but although I talk about that along the way to some extent, and it is a troubling thing to say. The title of the book, I loved movies, but dot dot dot. It's partly an allusion to Ozu's films. He had certain titles like that. The greatest is I Was Born, but dot dot dot. Wonderful title. I Flunked, but was one of his college movies. Great title. Um, but I loved movies, but it means that I formerly loved movies, and I mean I still love certain movies, and I still watch movies every day, and but I just don't have the passion that I used to for going to every movie and trying to keep up, and it's very hard to keep up with the wealth of stuff that's coming out. But what I'm specifically talking about, I think, is the American film industry. Um, which I've always focused on because, I'm an expert on Hollywood cinema. But I, when I came along, it was in the 60s, and I kind of naively thought I could go to Hollywood and make movies like John Ford used to make movies, or Hawks or Capra, one of these people I admired. And I think I would have been happy to some extent in the studio period, even though there were a lot of negative qualities to the studio period. People complained a lot, but they made a lot of movies. Each studio made about one movie a week, and they cranked them out, and they were of varying quality, but along the way they made some good ones. And they actually cared. Most of the moguls were guys who had come up through exhibition or some other field, and they really cared about making good movies. They obviously the industry has always been about money, but they don't think like that anymore. And there's a variety, I mean, quite a lot of reasons for it. One is that the cost of movies has escalated in, mainstream filmmaking. These movies are ridiculously expensive. On the other hand, in independent filmmaking, you can make a movie, as I said, for nothing now, and or modest amounts of money, and still make a good movie. Um, but they don't think like that. I once talked to a producer. They were threatening to remake Gone with the Wind. And I said to this guy, he was a studio chief, and I said, why would they want to remake Gone with the Wind? Everybody's going to hate it. And he said, well, it's probably going to be a bad movie, but it'll come out and for about a week, everybody will be talking about it and they'll say they hate it or whatever, and it'll make a lot of money. And that's the whole point. But that's not a good reason to make a film. You should make a film hoping that it will be good and unusual. And even if it's a genre film, Hollywood is very much into genre films. It's hard to make movies that are unusual. I mean, when I was a screenwriter, I was constantly trying to make films on unusual subjects. But my friend Sam Hamm, who's a screenwriter, I was complaining about genre films. He said, well, when you think about the movies we liked from the 30s and 40s, those were mostly genre films. Hollywood was into genres in a big way. They'd make westerns, they'd make crime films, they'd make romantic comedies, whatever. And there's nothing wrong with the genre because you can build on it and use the audience interest in it to do inflections on it. And that's true. But there's a kind of a crass conformism that goes on in American films. And I also realized when I came to Hollywood that I didn't know much about the blacklist until I came to Hollywood, and I studied that in a big way for my Capra and Ford books. But I also got to know blacklisted people and even some informers, and I realized how that has had a serious permanent effect on Hollywood. People are afraid to deal with sensitive political subjects in Hollywood ever since the blacklist. Hollywood is just terminally afraid of originality these days, I guess is what I would say. And I quote Scorsese in my book, and nobody loves movies more than him. But he said, what makes him really sad is the element of risk is taken out of movies now. They don't want to risk anything with he said the vision of a filmmaker, for example, is a risk. If you tell some filmmaker you can make this film because you deeply care about it, that's a risk because it might not work, or it might bomb or whatever, but you have to take risks to make good films. And he said the system has kind of blocked risk taking, and he still manages to make films, but he's been at it for a long time. But even Spielberg and Scorsese, these guys sometimes have trouble getting films made, but they're not the ones that we should worry about. It's most filmmakers, the new filmmakers, how are they going to get movies made and how are they going to get original movies made? I talk in my book about some of the original projects I had. I mean, one that I had back in the early 80s, I had a wonderful idea for a biopic of Fidel Castro.
Hmm.
This is the early 80s, and it would have been a lot of fun and interesting. But can you imagine me going in there in the early days of the Reagan years saying, I want to do a biopic of Fidel Castro? People would look at me like, ah.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, I think films are not as important to people's lives. Paul Schrader made a point recently. He said, one reason the films of the 60s and 70s seem so good is that film meant a lot to people back then. They'd go to see the current film and they'd have debates about it, and they were passionate about the subjects. And wow, have you seen Taxi Driver or Chinatown or whatever? And let's talk about it and have Bonnie and Clyde, have arguments about it. And he said that passion doesn't exist anymore. People are not as interested. I mean, a lot of people, actually, one of the things that shocked me, and I don't know what your answer for this would be, but when I was teaching in my last few years, um, I could see over the years fewer and fewer students were into cinephilia. Like when I came there, I taught Hitchcock and I had like 80 people in the class. And then I did it again. It was like 60. And then it got down to 40. And then it got down to 20. And finally I taught it and it was like 12 people. And the university, because of the financial crunch universities have, said we can't have classes that are fewer than 12 or 10 people or whatever. And so they made it hard to teach those kind of classes. Eventually students would tell me they didn't watch movies at all.
Mm.
A lot of students, they actually don't watch the new movies. And I used to come in on Monday and I'd say, so what did you guys see over the weekend? And we'd talk about the current film that just opened. And then after a while, I'd say, what did you see over the weekend? And they would have blank expression. They don't see a lot. They're not interested in a lot of current movies. And so I would say, what are you interested in? And they watch YouTube videos and things. And
Mm.
what do you find about that?
I'm so sorry. Can you narrow down the question a little bit? That's a big topic.
Well, yeah,
What do I find about people watching YouTube versus watching movies?
yeah. Well, I mean, you're somewhat different because you're a serious film buff and scholar, so you do watch classic films and
I
modern
try. I
and
try.
modern films. I mean, nobody can keep up with everything, obviously, but I'm just saying that how do you feel about a lot of your peers, not all, obviously, don't seem to be interested in watching current movies, even though they're cinema majors.
Yeah, that when you put it like that, that is befuddling. Going into a cinema major and not studying cinema is to me strange. I'll
Yeah,
say that.
it doesn't make any sense because, if you're a doctor, you'd be fascinated by the human body and medicine and, whatever. And if you're going to be a filmmaker, why are they bothering to go to cinema school if you don't want to see movies?
Right. I the only answer I can think of is that and this is not me, but that they purely want to learn like videography, that they purely want to learn the technical skills as opposed to actually studying what goes into making the film. Yeah, I mean,
Or,
like
or
like
the
the art of it.
yeah, or the history of filmmaking. They don't care. I mean, in a way, I can almost understand like if somebody is a real original, they might feel I don't need to see other movies. I'm just going to do what I want to do. But you know, a lot of the best filmmakers we love, like Spielberg and um, Scorsese and Tarantino, people like that are huge movie buffs. Joe Dante, they
Yeah.
know all kinds of more movies than I've seen. Um, but you're right. I think, well, I mean, it is fine to be into video and videography um, but there
That's the
is a
only thing I can think of.
yeah, there is an art obviously to learning cinematography and editing and all those things that, if you're going to go to film school, you have to know these things. Um, I'm not saying you shouldn't know the history of film, but I think it does help to know the history of film. I was under a false impression because the industry that I wanted to get into was not the industry that existed even in the 60s and 70s. It was the days when John Ford was making films in the 30s and 40s. It was an entirely different system. And it was a failure on my part to understand the history of things to some extent. I mean, it takes a long time. When I first came to Hollywood, I realized they don't tell you a lot of how things work. Like it was big mystery about how the business worked, for example. And I had to learn on my own because I was a business writer for Variety, and I had to ask people all kinds of questions to find out all kinds of practices in the industry. They kept it kind of secretive because it was kind of a plan like activity. They didn't want outsiders in there. And then the history of film wasn't being studied much until, the late 60s. And then we started learning a lot about Hollywood was as great as, French cinema or Italian cinema. But until then, people didn't think that. But anyway, the point is, I had to learn by doing it and learn on the job by writing books and stuff. And so by the time I wrote my Capra book from 84 to 92, I think I understood the industry well by that time, but I had paid a lot of dues to get to that point. But maybe today I sort of understand how if kids are not taught in high school the history of our country, for example, they're really at a disadvantage. And I see this. There was a survey a few years ago that American high school students thought that we were fighting the Russians in World War II and that the
Mm,
Germans were our allies. Can you believe this?
no.
Yes, the majority of American high school students thought
Holy
this.
mackerel.
This is shocking. And so when I taught courses, I would teach them as history classes at the same time. I used to teach a course called Film and Society, where I showed films and social issues, so I could talk about Vietnam or Watergate or World War II, whatever. And some kid put his hand up and said, "I didn't know this was supposed to be a history class." Like he was upset. And I said, "Well, yeah, but if the kids are not taught history or the history of film, they're kind of at a loss to know how to get into the world of filmmaking. What are they, they're kind of, how are they going to do it?"
I don't know.
Well, yeah.
But for whatever it's worth, for whatever my opinion's worth, I'm grateful that you took the time to teach me. That it really helped me, and I'm sorry that it didn't bring you what you wanted, but you
Well,
helped me.
I appreciate. I mean, you were the kind of student we like to have, which is somebody who really wants to learn and is receptive. You know, um, one of my colleagues, Jenny Lau, who's from China, she's from Hong Kong. She said Confucius said there are three kinds of students. There are the ones who are so good that you can't really teach them anything; you can just encourage them. And then she said there are some who are just hopeless because they don't know how to learn or they refuse to learn for some reason. But she said most students, according to Confucius, are in the middle. They're called the teachables. He called them the teachables. And so what you hope is to have the teachables. And you were certainly somebody who really wanted to learn, and you were wise enough to, I mean, you have to kind of, there's a famous quote from Socrates who said, all I know is that I know nothing. And
Yeah,
I I learned that a long time ago, and I kind of took that as my mantra when I was a student, or when I interview people in the film business, that I would feel no qualms about saying, "Please tell me how this happened," or whatever, you know.
I
Um,
agree with. Yeah, for me, I agree. Yeah,
yeah, so you're a good, you know, you're the kind of student who is going to succeed. And you also are out
thank
there
you.
making your own films, which is something I always tell students. Don't just sit around talking about making films or saying, I'd like to be a director. Go out and make a film. Anybody can do it now. And, but you learn so much every time you make a film, and you're out and doing it. And so I have hopes for guys like you that you're the kind of person who will succeed. Anybody with some talent and who's a hard worker has a good chance of still succeeding in the film business. I feel I've had, you know, a satisfying life writing my books and working on some films that have amounted to something like The Other Side of the Wind and Rock and Roll High School. You know, that's enough. And I've been involved in some other films and TV shows too. But I mean, I've had a good time doing all this and contributed what I could. And but I just feel that you know, I was sort of miscast going into the film business. So I don't think I was quite suited for certainly the modern film industry. I think I would have succeeded more happily in the golden age. I could have been a contract writer or whatever, and I would have complained a lot, but I would have had more chances. But you know, I did pretty well as screenwriters go. I had uh, three movies and part of another movie made, and I sold several other scripts, and you know, and I did nine TV shows or documentaries. That's pretty good for a 10-year period as a screenwriter. Um, but I'm more successful and happier as a book writer.
Sorry to interrupt listeners, but this is just a reminder that my half-hour short film Structure has been completed and has been submitted to film festivals. After its film festival run, it will be released online. Here's a clip from the film.
Well, if you want to get better writing, you got to read Shakespeare, Aristotle.
I want to make something completely new. Completely new.
If you want something new, you got to have a foundation to build on. Every device that's used in dramatic works comes from other great works. If you want to write something new, you've got to read those. You know why I love my job?
Because you're a dork?
Yes. And also because I get to read stories. Stories are everything. Stories are bridges to people. Stories are a way for humanity to connect with one another. Maybe if we had more stories, we could all treat each other with a little bit more compassion.
If you're interested in learning more, Emerging Artist Magazine has written a profile of myself as well as Structure, and I will include a link to that article in the show notes. Now, on to part two of my discussion with Joe McBride, in which we discuss Orson Welles' The Magnificent Ambersons. Speaking of betrayal, speaking of difficult artistic processes, let's talk about Orson Welles
Yeah, yeah.
and then The Magnificent Ambersons. That because there's a lot to dive into there. Um, so you've said that John Ford is your favorite director, but that Orson Welles' Magnificent Ambersons is your favorite film. What would you say, just to begin the conversation, what would you say are the key differences between John Ford and Orson Welles as filmmakers?
Well, they have a lot in common because Wells's favorite director was John Ford, and Ford liked Wells too. And they're both into the past. They deal with the past quite a lot and its effect on the present. And they kind of have a bittersweet view of the world. And Ambersons is very Fordian in some ways. And it started shooting the day that How Green Was My Valley opened, and it has definite visual influences, I think, from How Green Was My Valley,
Hmm.
some of the compositions. And also they're both films about a society that has vanished, the, the mining town that's become polluted and How Green Was My Valley, and the old Indianapolis and Ambersons that has been sort of gobbled up by the modernization, and the old aristocratic families have kind of been wiped out. And it's very much a Midwestern film, and I'm from the Midwest, and so I recognize Wells is a Midwesterner. That's one reason I kind of gravitated toward him. And there's kind of a pioneer spirit that you see in Ambersons, but also kind of a overreaching in terms of um, people building and spending money and things, and a lot of people were ruined by those things. And the Middle West was modernized in the lifetime of Wells. And, I could see some of that going on in Wisconsin when I was growing up. Wells is from Kenosha, Wisconsin. I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So it's a film about family too. It's about a very dysfunctional family. It's about a young boy who kills his mother, basically. I mean, he literally kills his mother through his arrogance and his mistreatment of his mother. And he's this very tragic figure. George Amberson Minifer, played wonderfully well by Tim Holt, who doesn't get credit for what a good actor he was. Um, and what I link it to is Wells felt he had killed his father. And he wrote about this late in his life. His father was an industrialist and playboy who took him around the world, and kind of a wonderful guy in a lot of ways, but he was a severe alcoholic and he drank himself to death.
Mm.
And Wells was in boarding school, the Todd School for Boys, and he called that his Camelot in Illinois. And he had to be kind of raised by surrogate parents in a sense, because his mother died and his father was an alcoholic. And so Roger Hill and his wife Hortense were kind of taking care of the young Orson, and they persuaded him to tell his father, "I won't see you anymore unless you stop drinking. This is what we call, tough love." And Wells did that, and his father died of a broken heart. He felt he drank. According to his death certificate, he died in a hotel room in Chicago of kidney and heart disease, I believe. But Wells felt his father actually had committed suicide, but it's not clear. I mean, it could have happened. They could have covered it up. But I think in a sense he meant maybe more metaphorically by drinking yourself to death as a form of suicide. And Wells felt he had caused that. It's more complicated than the young Wells felt, but he's 15 years old and he felt he had killed his father. I mean, he literally felt that. And but I think that was too hard for him to deal with. But if you look at his films, they're all about betrayals by, it's usually about two men who love each other, often a younger man and a younger man, and they're good friends, and one betrays the other, and that happens over and over and over in Wells's films. So I don't think he was quite ready to. Well, in Kane, Joseph Cotton and Wells have that kind of relationship where they both betray each other in a sense. But his mother sells him to a bank. It's
Yeah.
another thing. When I tell people this, they say, "Well, no, that's not true." But no, it's literally true in the movie. His mother sells him to a bank, and she never sees him again. I mean, it's shocking. Um, and then in Ambersons, the boy kills his mother. So I think what he was dealing with was he couldn't quite deal with the father, so he's dealing with killing the mother in a sense. And when you look at Chimes of Midnight, which is the film that most resembles Ambersons in his body of work, his 1966 film about Shakespeare's Falstaff and Prince Hal. Prince Hal betrays Falstaff when he becomes king. His old companion is banished by Prince Hal, and it breaks Falstaff's heart, and he dies. And that, to me, is a direct psychological representation of Wells's guilt about killing his father. And Falstaff is an old drunk and playboy and fun guy, but a troublesome drunk. And Hal tragically has to do that to become king. And Wells, when he was young, felt he had to cut off his father, and but there's a price to pay for this kind of thing. So I think that this accounts for the profound feeling in both Chimes of Midnight and Ambersons that are so similar, and also this kind of regret for this lost Eden. Wells talked about the lost Eden was a big theme with him, as it is in American literature in general. That's a huge theme in our country because of the history of our country. And so the destruction of the town in Ambersons is sort of idyllic, but it has flaws too. But the modern world, and especially the automobile, destroy this town. And when RKO butchered this film, Wells turned in a 131-minute semi-final version. They cut it to 88 minutes, and they reshot parts of it, and it was really mangled. They cut a lot of the political stuff that dealt with industrialization and air pollution. This film in 1942, the film was dealing with the environment and air pollution, how the automobile had polluted this atmosphere, and it's dealt with explicitly in the film. They cut out as much of that as they could. So it was a mangled, mutilated masterpiece, and the ending was lost. They destroyed the footage they had cut. There is a guy named Joshua Grossberg who's making a documentary called The Lost Print, and it's about his search for the missing Ambersons print that might exist. It's a long story, but Wells had a copy of it in Rio de Janeiro when he was making this documentary, It's All True. And people blame him for leaving Ambersons in post-production and going to South America to make this documentary. But they don't realize that the US government basically told him it was his patriotic duty to go make this Good Neighbor film in South America right after Pearl Harbor, which happened during the shooting of Ambersons. So Wells went there, and he really didn't want to do it, but he was told by RKO that Robert Wise, his editor, was going to come down to Rio, and they were going to finalize the editing down there. And Wells had a print of the film. He had 30 cans of nitrate film down there. And Wise couldn't get a plane ride down there supposedly because of the war, civilian air travel was curtailed. But it might have been RKO didn't want to cooperate with Wells. There was a faction at RKO that was trying to get rid of Wells. And I discovered what I considered the smoking gun of Wells's career, which is he was fired by RKO for allegedly being wasteful on It's All True and going over budget. And I discovered documents in their files that show that they deliberately lied to him about what the budget was. It was 1.2 million. And when he was fired for allegedly going over budget, the expenditures on that film were, I think, 743,000. So he was more than 400,000 under budget when he was fired for being allegedly over budget. And he never quite knew what the real budget was. I found the documents in RKO's papers, but he had a sense that it was more than they were telling him. But it was really sabotage, and they put out this butchered version of this great film. It's really heartbreaking, and I have a passion for film maudit, as they call it, which means a damned film. It's a French term for films that are troubled, and I'm always kind of protective of films that are damaged. But I sure would love to see the complete version. Josh has been looking for it, and he's kind of gone underground. He hasn't said whether he's found anything, but he's been to Brazil. There's some thought that Wells may have left his print on there. And Josh is hoping to find it, but at least he says he'll tell the story of the whole thing in this documentary for TCM, and I'm in the film. But Roger Ryan, who's a friend of mine, has put together, in the 90s, he put together a restored version of Ambersons. He took the 88-minute version and he included stills, frame enlargements and publicity stills. And we know what the shots were supposed to be and what the dialogue was because the cutting continuity survived. And so he had actors, amateur actors, including himself and his wife and his friends, do the voices of the characters. And I love the amateur quality of it because they don't try to imitate Joseph Cotten or Agnes Moorehead or whatever. They're just doing it out of love, which, as Wells said, he loved amateurs because the word comes from love, the Latin word for love. And it is a shocking film to show. I show this in my classes. I would show the cut version, then I'd show Roger's version, which is about 30 minutes longer. It's not complete because he couldn't find stills for everything. But it is shocking how different the film is, how much more political and grim, the film is, if you can see a facsimile of the original version. Unfortunately, they didn't put that on the Criterion Blu-ray. Roger had talked to them about putting it on there and they were considering it, but the producer of the Blu-ray said, well, we were thinking about it, but it would have forced us to have 2 discs instead of 1 and it would have caused more money. And, it's a shame that he said, maybe we should have done it. I mean, geez, but maybe someday that version will come out. Right now, it's not publicly viewable because Roger doesn't own the film, but Warner Brothers, that owns the film, is aware of his version and doesn't mind that he did it, but you can only see it if people send copies around. But it's my favorite film. I mean, it's still, as Robert Wise, who I knew well, said, well, I think the fact that the film is still considered a classic shows that we didn't destroy Orson's masterpiece, which I think is specious reasoning. But there are such great scenes and so much great material in the film. It is wonderful, but then it sort of goes to pieces when they start reshooting and re-editing the film. But one of the things I mentioned in I Love Movies, but it's interesting human paradox is that I got to know Robert Wise quite well. He was a very nice man, and I liked him as a person. And I was even talking to him about a couple of film projects that we were going to do. And I thought, here's the guy who destroyed my favorite work of art. He's like the guy, the maniac who took a hammer to the Pietà at the Vatican and smashed part of the statue. And yet I'm friendly with him and he's a nice man. And he actually sincerely thought, he said, we were trying to save Orson's film because they thought it was unreleasable. He said, if you'd been at that preview in Pomona, you would have understood because people were walking out and hooting at the film. And yet in the preview cards, which I've read, a couple of people said it was the greatest film they'd ever seen, and they made a few cuts and they showed it again in Pasadena, and then it had a pretty good preview in Pasadena. If they had left it as it was with the ending intact, it would have been okay. And actually, one of the things I found, ironically, the film was considered a flop for a long time, but I looked at the Variety records on how the film did, and it actually had some good openings in certain places, like in San Francisco. First week, $25,000, a lot of money. Second week, 15,000. That's very good. Some places it didn't open well, but it was sort of mixed. But if they had let it play in theaters for a while, it would have made a profit. But they pulled it after about 2 weeks, and they deliberately sabotaged the film, and they put it on a double bill with a movie called Mexican Spitfire Sees a Ghost, of all movies.
That seems like the wrong seems like the wrong move. To
See,
say the most obvious statement of the century, that seems like the wrong double bill.
yeah, it's like saying we don't like this film. It's like what happened with John Ford's Seven Women, his last feature. MGM dumped it onto double bills with films like The Money Trap and some other films. It's a kind of way of saying we don't respect this film.
Touch of Evil was the B feature to some other crime film.
Yeah, I don't know which. Actually, that's a
I
good
don't know
question.
actually. Yeah.
But yeah, it was released as a B movie in neighborhood theaters, and it didn't get much of a showcase. Even so, Ambersons got some good reviews and some Oscar nominations. It was nominated for Best Picture, and Agnes Moorehead was nominated for Best Supporting Actress. And she should have won. It's one of
Yeah.
the all-time great performances. But she did win the New York Film Critics Award for Best Supporting Actress. And I went into her papers at the University of Wisconsin there's a folder there for speech accepting the New York Critics Award, and it's empty. Somebody stole it.
No.
This is, everything that can possibly done to damage a film has been done to Ambersons, you know.
Should speaking as a critic, should the circumstances that lead to a final film influence how a viewer watches and critiques the final product?
Well, at the time, back in those days, people didn't report on these problems. Today, the word would have gotten around, but Manny Farber, who's a kind of eccentric critic who I think is somewhat overrated, but sometimes brilliant, he gave the film a bad review, but he was the only critic who mentioned that there was some evidence of kind of hasty cutting, or I don't know what he said, but he sort of realized that there was some kind of cutting involved that didn't help the film. And he said it had a hearts and flowers finish, which is inappropriate to the story, which is true. Wells's ending was devastating. Um, but people didn't know back then that the film had been put through the grinder, and Wells didn't talk about it. Filmmakers didn't go public and complain back then. David O. Selznick, the producer of Gone with the Wind, um, tried to persuade RKO to give a print of the original uncut version to the Museum of Modern Art.
Oh
He,
wow.
he said someday, in the future, people are going to want to see this. And wow, he was so right. And RKO wouldn't do that. I mean, what a shame, what a tragedy. Um, but I think that now that we know the history of it, it does color our view of the film to some extent. We can understand why certain things in the film are mediocre and other things are brilliant, or certain story points um, have gaps or are confusing or whatever, and some of the scenes are out of order, and it helps us understand the film, and it does enhance your appreciation for. I mean, I ended my long essay on Ambersons in my book Orson Welles by quoting Wordsworth's Reflections on Immortality from Early Childhood, where he talked about splendor in the grass. It's a famous quote. It's in the film Splendor in the Grass, and it's basically rather than regret what we've lost. I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, "Find strength in what remains behind." And that's a good way of looking at life in a sense too. And I feel kind of that way about my own life. Is we all have losses and successes, and we have personal losses and we have professional losses, but find strength in what remains behind, that things that were good in your life or things you've achieved. And that's kind of how I look at Ambersons. Is okay, it's sad what it could have been, but I'm happy we have what we have.
I agree with you. Just to briefly share, if I may, my opinion of Ambersons,
Sure.
and I feel that Wells's, for the uninitiated listener, that Wells's first film, Citizen Kane, is the more technically advanced film, but I also feel that Ambersons is a much more personal vision for Wells.
Mhm.
I would say Ambersons is less technically advanced, probably because of the cutting and the reshooting, misshooting, whatever you want to call it. Although both are incredible works of art, the more personal vision makes Ambersons more enjoyable for me personally to rewatch than the Citizen Kane. But of course, they're both amazing. So
Yeah, they're both amazing at that level. It's hard to choose, although Kane, was virtually uncut. I mean, they forced him to make a few cuts for censorship
yeah.
problems, but it was pretty much the film that he wanted. Um, So that's a big difference with Amberson's. Kane's technique is much more obvious and visible. It's very virtuosic, of course, and it's just amazing. But Amberson's has some fantastic technical achievements, like the ballroom sequence, the ball at the Amberson Mansion, the last of the great long remembered dances that everybody talked about, is the way it's put, is a marvel of staging and camera work, and it's just one of the great sequences in film. However, they cut a long tracking shot from that sequence that would have been one of the great, probably, moving camera shots in film history. Wells once said, in moving the camera, I feel I have no peer, which is true. He and Max Ophuls, probably the two greatest people who know how to move the camera. But Amberson's, Truffaut kind of agreed with you on. He said when you see Kane, he said today there'll be twice as many people in the theater watching Kane as there are Ambersons. But he said Ambersons had a deeper emotional impact on him, which I think is true. That Kane is kind of a cold, studied film, and looking at the character from a satirical distance to some extent. But Amberson's is plunges you into the heart of great emotions and turmoil, and you feel profoundly about these characters. I mean, it's based on a very good novel by Booth Tarkington, which won the Pulitzer Prize. It's an excellent novel to begin with, and Wells was a huge Tarkington fan, so it has great depth of characterization, and Wells's feelings about the milieu and the mise en scène and I went to Kenosha a few years ago for I showed Ambersons in his neighborhood. Right around the corner from his house, they had the women's club, and we showed it there. And wow, that little neighborhood looks so much like the Ambersons neighborhood. And his grandmother had a house right around the corner from where he lived. And I was allowed to go in there by the lady who owned the house. She wasn't letting anybody else in, but it's very much like the Amberson Mansion, smaller, but kind of Baroque, and kind of has all these little twists and turns. And Wells said that when he was a kid, he would go into his grandmother's house, and in the attic, he said she had it used to be a ballroom, and he said the floor had springs in it that
Oh, wow.
if when you danced, you were kind of floating on springs, and actually that was the house. And so I said, do you have that? And she said, well, yeah, I'll go up in the attic there. And it's actually very small. It's an attic, but it does have springs. And he would go up there and sort of dance by himself, is what he did as a kid. It wasn't this grand, town ball like in the film, but the influence of that neighborhood and that setting, and it's on a kind of a town square like in the old days, and also the Woodstock, Illinois, where he went to prep school, is very much in the milieu of the Ambersons. The town square is intact, just like it was in the early 1900s, late 1890s. They have a bandstand like cities used to have, and they have the opera house where he put on plays, and they have a jail where Eugene Debs was put in prison for a year when he was running for president by Woodrow Wilson. His opponent put his socialist rival into jail. Debs was in that prison. But you can see the Ambersons milieu in Woodstock and Kenosha that Wells was drawing from in his very profound emotional connections that you respond to. And I think that is true. That it's a more modest film. I think Truffaut said it shows humility in a sense that it's not a show-offy film like Kane is kind of a young filmmaker showing off his thrill with the medium and the tools. And Ambersons is a more restrained film, but there is great technique in it. And the acting is just magnificent. I think Truffaut also said you're more interested in the characters than in the technique, which is basically true.
Wells and Emerson's. Well, I'm speaking. I'm assuming it was Wells. Wells and Ambersons, in terms of the directing, knows when to hold back, as opposed to Kane when it was here's all my ideas.
Right, right. I think he got a lot out of his system in the sense that he had done this virtuosic thing, famous quote, it's the greatest electric train set any boy ever had, when he came to RKO. And he worked with the great Greg Toland, cinematographer. And but with Ambersons, it is more, he's immersing you. And Ford does this in his films too, that you feel like you're back in a time and place that's gone. And Wells said, Ford knows what the earth is made of. That's a way of saying that they both create this very alluring past that seems so real, and as Mike Wilmington and I wrote in our book on Ford, Ford's films are imaginary visions of an ideal world, but they seem very real, even though they're idealized or romantic, like in My Darling Clementine or something like that. How Green Was My Valley. And yet they have dark sides too. And Wells is doing that. He's immersing us into this milieu, and the camera movements push you into it, draw you into it, without hitting you over the head with it. So it's a different kind of film. Chimes of Midnight is a bit like that too. When I first wrote about that, I said it seemed to be not very technically showy, and then I realized watching this film over the years, it's actually a very advanced film technically in terms of the camera movements and blocking and staging and everything. And I kind of felt the film had invisible technique, but it just doesn't at all. I mean, it's flamboyant in its own way, but it draws you into that world of merry old England. It's another one of his lost Edens. So that's one reason we have maybe a more emotional absorption in both of those pictures.
In terms of the technical aspects, do you think that the differences visually can be attributed to the cinematographers, the changes between them?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the problem that Wells had. Greg Toland was the greatest cameraman ever, probably, and he couldn't get him for that film because Goldwyn had him under contract and he couldn't get him. Um, but so he hired Stanley Cortez, who's a very talented young cameraman, but hadn't really had the experience of doing a big film, and he wasn't quite up to it. He was slow. Wells felt he was too slow, and that caused problems with the studio. And Wells told me once, he said, he showed me this telegram he had inviting him to come to a tribute to Stanley Cortez, and he laughed bitterly, and he said, he's the only cameraman I ever fired, which isn't quite true. He fired a couple later, but he said that Cortez was so slow that in early January 1942, after Pearl Harbor, and Wells was under great pressure to finish the film so he could get down to Rio for the carnival, he said he fired Cortez uh, and brought another cameraman, but Cortez came to him and was crying and said, please let me stay on the film. So he said, I let Cortez have his own second unit on another set. He would set up some shot that would take a long time to light, while Wells was working with Russell Meddy or Harry Wilde, two faster, more experienced cameramen on another set. Cortez would say, okay, I'm ready to shoot. And Wells would go over to the other stage and shoot that scene. So Cortez wasn't the lead DP on the last month of shooting. And he never told the truth about that. I did a panel discussion once with Cortez, and I found him deceitful because he never talked about that. I mean, I guess it's difficult to talk about, but I didn't know about that at the time. But he was a great cameraman. I mean, he did The Night of the Hunter, which is one of the all-time great feats of cinematography that Charles Laughton directed. But he did two Sam Fuller movies that were shot real fast. Shock Corridor was shot in 10 days on one set.
Mm.
Cortez shot that, and then he did The Naked Kiss. And I should have asked Sam Fuller, how did you get Stanley Cortez to shoot this film in 10 days?
Right.
It's really stunning looking film. Shock Corridor, great B movie that's great expressionist lighting, But I guess Cortez in his later years adapted. He was fired also from Chinatown, which is interesting. Another great film. Polanski didn't like the work he had done for the first week, so he fired him and replaced him with John Alonzo. But Cortez was also a very pompous character, and Wells found him difficult to work with. He would say things. He liked to refer to music and painting in talking about scenes, and Wells found that uh, irritating. He would say things like, "Orson, doesn't this scene remind you of Rembrandt's An Old Man Seated?" Another thing he said was, "Orson, doesn't this scene remind you of Respighi's Fountains of Rome?" And I understand, I know the scenes that he's talking about, the close-up of Major Amberson dying and the death of the mother has the rippling light effects, kind of like Respighi's Fountains of Rome. But Wells found this horribly irritating pomposity. I did find Cortez very pompous, but he was an artist and he was a strange guy. You kind of have to adapt to your collaborators, but Wells was under a lot of pressure and he didn't have patience for this guy. And um, but still, I mean, it's still a beautifully shot film. Like the ballroom, it took, I think, 2 days to light that scene, which is not unusual to have a huge set you have to light. RKO didn't like that it took 2 days to light it, but then they shot it, I think, in 3 days, and it was a big part of the film. Um, you can't really fault the cinematography in that sequence. Is great.
No, you can't.
Yeah, deep focus, wonderful. I mean, I don't think there's any problem with Cortez's cinematography except that he was too slow and had to be replaced by other cameramen. In the book, Wells at Work by two French guys, actually a Belgian and French scholar, there's a chart of all the scenes and it tells who photographed each scene. And the retakes were shot by another cinematographer too. So a lot of people worked on the shooting of that film.
Wells's background in stage, radio, and also I was rewatching a little bit of The Eyes of Orson Welles, his drawings and paintings. Do you
Mhm.
think that informed his filmmaking?
Oh yeah, I mean, he had a great visual sense, as you mentioned. That's a wonderful Mark Cousins documentary, The Eyes of Orson Welles. It's about his artwork. He was he loved painting and sketching, and he was very good at it. His talents were strong, and a lot of it survives. And Mark Cousins, it's an essay film like Wells did with F for Fake, and you get to understand Wells from looking at a lot of the imagery in his painting and drawing, and then he connects it intelligently to the filmmaking. So you can see where Wells got his influences from. Wells claimed he was not as big a cinephile as some directors, but he kind of pretended he was more ignorant of movies than he really was. Um, because I know that when he was younger, he loved Lubitsch and Ford and various directors. But um, for example, he claimed he was not influenced by German expressionist cinema, which seems like an obvious influence in his films. But what I realized was he said he didn't see that many German expressionist films, but he was influenced by the theater. German expressionism was also a art movement and a theatrical movement. And Michael McLeamore and Hilton Edwards were these two Irish impresarios who had the Gate Theater. They both would go to the continent and watch German expressionist plays, and they were influenced by them and the staging in Dublin when Wells spent time there as a young actor, crew guy. So I think he learned German expressionism kind of through the theatrical vision of these two guys.
And we talked about a little bit how Orson Welles is probably the greatest director of actors, along with Ingmar Bergman, George Cukor. Um, what in your opinion, what makes the performances in Welles films stand out from the films of his contemporaries?
Yeah, I would mention those directors and Max Ophuls too. I would say
Okay.
he's a really great director of actors. I think that I noticed this when working with him on Other Side of the Wind for 5 years as an actor, and I was an amateur. So I just let myself be molded by him telling me what to do, and he was very strict about not having me, improvise um, movements. I had to do the movements he told me to do and not add anything. But he let me talk to him before each scene, and we would work out my dialogue together. I mean, he let me participate in coming up with the dialogue because I play a young film critic and historian who asks kind of arcane film buff questions of John Huston's character. And Welles enjoyed hearing my thoughts on that, and then he would kind of twist it around to make it more satirical and more pretentious. But the thing I noticed with this very diverse cast he had was he treated everybody differently. And that I think is the secret of a really great actor's director. You don't treat everybody the same way. A bad actor's director will just has one way of dealing with everybody, and that's a way to have dull, you know, mediocre casts. But Wells had, great actors, Mercedes McCambridge, Edmund O'Brien, Susan Strasberg, people like that, John Huston, and he had a lot of interesting character actors, Norman Foster, Tonio Selward, all kinds of people. And then he had some non-actors like me and some other people, and just an amazing range. And he liked having that kind of potpourri of types of people in his movies. But he treated everybody differently, and he knew exactly what to say to everybody to get the best performance out of them. Good directors are psychologists. I'll give you my favorite example of a piece of direction from that film. Um, he handled John Huston with kid gloves because Huston was his peer. So he couldn't kind of order him around like he did with me. He had to treat him with great respect, and naturally he would anyway. But um, he felt that Huston's performing was, Huston didn't take acting too seriously. When he was younger, I think he did, and then he kind of started treating it. He called to me. He said his acting in that film was a lark. It was a lark, And but Wells wanted him to go deeper, and he did that in various ways, and found ways to dig into Huston's psychology and personality. And another thing he did was something you normally shouldn't do when you're directing. He got him drinking. He let him drink during the shooting. And by about 5 o'clock or 5:30, Huston would be slurring his words, and they'd have to stop. And Wells called that the vodka hour. I think we've reached the vodka hour, John. And Huston would then have some more drinks, and the next day he'd be fine. But Wells did that too.
Those were the 70s.
Well, you release the inhibitions of somebody when they're drinking, and it's considered
Right.
a bad way to direct, but it's risky, but it was worth trying. But he manipulated his psyche in wonderful ways. There was a scene that's not in the film, and I wish it were, where he shows up at the party with a young blonde teenager who he's appropriated from Peter Bogdanovich's character, and it's kind of a spoof of Sybil Shepherd's kind of vapid young actress character. And I think the scene was cut because Peter was sensitive about Wells making fun of him and Sybil. So Huston, at some point, you just see him with this teenage girl, and it's funny, but it's also kind of a Harvey Weinstein sexual harassment of a high school kid. But so the Hannaford character is kind of sinister in some ways, diabolical in certain ways, but charming in other ways. But anyway, so when he shows up at the party with this girl, I could tell that Huston overdid the lechery when he was showing off the girl. It was heavy-handed lechery kind of thing. And so I waited to see what Wells would say. And there was this pause, and Wells said, "John, you know who you remind me of in this scene?" And he said, "Who, Orson?" And he said, "Your father." And he said, "Oh, really, Orson? Why?" And John's father was the great actor Walter Huston, and John worshipped his father. And Wells had directed Walter Huston in the Ambersons radio program. And when Huston said, "Oh, really, Orson? Why?" And Wells said, "Because he had that kindly paternal air, but nobody ever had a higher score." And Huston loved that, and he broke into laughter. And as a tribute to his father being he had this very kind of courtly facade, but apparently he was quite a ladies' man. And so Huston played it with this kind of kindly paternal air. and not a heavy-handed, lecherous thing. And it was a wonderful, wonderful piece of acting. But what a great piece of direction.
Yes.
You don't tell him, hey, John, don't be so heavy-handed. I mean, that would have frozen him up.
Yeah.
But you just give a little clue about the attitude he should have and make it personal. And Houston loved it, you know, and he was just wonderful in that scene.
Can you offer insights into the overall process of Orson Welles writing a screenplay? Like, how does Orson Welles write a screenplay? Does that
Well,
make sense?
that film had a long gestation period. He started writing it after Hemingway killed himself, and the character is kind of partly inspired by Hemingway, who Wells knew well and admired, but he also saw his flaws. So he had been working on this project. It was going to be called The Sacred Beasts in the earlier incarnation. And over the years, he didn't get it made for whatever reason. And then he met Oya Kodar, his companion in later years. And she said she had a short story about an old director too. And they combined these projects. She gets co-writing credit, although nobody's ever found any actual writing she did on the film, but I'm sure she had a huge influence on the whole process. But um, they combine these ideas, and it became the story of this old director who's kind of sexually attracted to a young male actor who betrays him. He's kind of, you know, it's a complicated Falstaff Hal situation again. And it became more and more about the movie business and less about Hemingway stuff. Like originally, it was going to be a lot about bullfighting. The old the old movie director was going to be following the bullfights with a retinue of slavish fans, like Hemingway did. And the first day of shooting, we were told we were going to go to Tijuana to shoot the bullfights. And then I showed up and they said, oh, we decided not to go to Tijuana because we found out there's some problem taking cameras across the border. So Wells just dropped the whole bullfighting thing. And then I said, do you have a script? And he showed me a box under his typewriter table and it had a lot of stuff in it. And he said, I've been writing a lot of pages on this script, you know, and I know this character really well. But he said, I realized I was writing a novel and it has to be a film. And but he didn't have an exact script in 1970 when we started shooting. So he would say, so what would you say here? And what would you say here? And one thing I came up with was because he had described the storyline to me, um, that the old director winds up dying in a suicidal car crash. And I knew that he was based on Hemingway. And I said, I suggested that I would ask him what the influence of his father's suicide was on his film work, because I knew that Hemingway's father had killed himself, and this was a profound thing. And Hemingway then killed himself, and Wells immediately picked up on that. He thought that was great, and I didn't realize then that Wells felt his father had killed himself, you know. And so we came up with a question about that, and he made it sound a little more pretentious. I have the handwriting where I was writing it down. It's something like, in the body of your film work, how would you place the influence of your father's suicide? Something, you know, a little pompous. And so I asked him that in the car, and he doesn't really respond, but he gets irritated. Originally in the film, I was going to be thrown out of the car for asking that impertinent question. And then they changed it to I was thrown out of the car because another character comes up on a motorcycle and says you're overloaded and somebody's got to go. And I thought it was better when I was thrown out for asking a difficult question, you know. But so Wells, and then that theme began shaping the script more, because by the time I came back in 1971 for more shooting, he had a completed shooting script that was pretty close to the final film. And the scenes about the father's suicide were they talked about it in the film, and it became more of an overt theme in the film. And so I think I helped influence that aspect of the film, but I was picking up on things that Wells had told me about it and hinted at. And some of the characters in his films, well, they wind up destroying themselves in one way or another, you know. And so it's a kind of a quasi-suicidal impulse. So that's that's one concrete example. I also had one time I said, why don't we ask him what he thinks of the work of Dziga Vertov, the Soviet filmmaker. Wells said, "You're kidding. Who's that?" He claimed he'd never heard of him. And I said, Dziga Vertov was a Soviet filmmaker who made propaganda films called Kino Pravda. And Wells roared with laughter. He thought that was so silly. But he said, no, let's ask, because Godard was very into Vertov at that time, and his films were being made by what he called the Dziga Vertov group, I guess is what he called it. So I guess Wells had somehow seen this connection. Maybe I meant no, I mentioned to Wells that Godard was influenced by Vertov and the Vertov group, he called himself. So Wells came up with a Vertovian Godardian question, which is something like, is the camera eye a reflection of reality, or is reality a reflection of the camera eye? And then there's a pause. Or is the camera really a phallus? And the first one, the camera eye thing, was the takeoff of the Kino eye. But then the phallus line, I didn't tell Wells where I got it from, but Rex Reed had profiled Peter Fonda for Esquire, and Peter Fonda was talking about being in a Roger Vadim film, and he said his camera is a phallus. So I said, why don't we ask him if the camera is a phallus? And Wells just loved that. He thought that was hysterically funny. And that fits the theme of the film very deeply, because a lot of it is about machismo and virility and what I call the phallocracy, which is actually a word of, it's kind of like patriarchal society. At the end of the film, this giant phallus falls over, you remember? And Oya Kodar is hacking at her with a scissors. And so I'm asking, is the camera a phallus? And he loved that. And then I noticed that Peter Bogdanovich started saying, I have that line in The Other Side of the Wind. Peter said he said the line. I thought, well, wait a minute, I said that line. And then I found out what happened when I watched the documentary on the film. It has a lot of outtakes. They'll love me when I'm dead. What Wells did was, about a week later, he was shooting a scene with Peter near some train tracks, and he gave Peter the same dialogue. Mm-hmm. He had Peter ask him, is the camera phallus? So he gave him my line. So actually Peter did say the line, but the only one that wound up in the film is my take on it, because Peter was playing a different character than he was playing a young, silly film critic. He and I were a pair of kind of silly film critics. But when he went to Texas right after that to make The Last Picture Show, it made him an important young director. So Wells rewrote the script and made Peter a hotshot young director. And it became more the Falstaff Hal theme again. The young man, the old man thinks he's betrayed him. It's complicated. And so you have two betrayals going on. You have the young actor and the young director, both disappointing this old man. And so this is kind of how the creative process worked. Wells kept working on the script as he went along. I found in my script copy, there's a scene when I saw the film. I was a consultant on the completion of it with Jonathan Rosenbaum. When I saw the film, there's a whole scene that I did that I had no memory of, where I go up to Houston and presumptuously offer to help him raise money to finish his film. And he was supposed to squeeze me on the cheek and say, always remember, Mr. Pister, that your heart is God's little garden. That was the line that Wells loved. But Houston wasn't there at the time because he was shooting The Man Who Would Be King. Mm-hmm. So we did it with a double for Houston shooting over this guy's shoulder. And then Wells shot a big close-up of Houston later. And he says the line, but he doesn't squeeze me on the cheek, which I was looking forward to. I saw this scene. I didn't remember shooting it. It's like I have a good memory, but I couldn't remember it. So I looked at my script, and there it was folded into the script. It was some carbon paper, like 2 or 3 sheets of carbon paper with this added scene, which he added in 1974, I think. So he kept revising as he went along on this film, and it's a good way to make a film. He spent 5 years working on it, kept seeing deeper levels and nuances in it, and he left it unfinished, but he shot about 98% of it, and Bob Murawski did a wonderful job, I think, of editing the film.
If we can go back to Ambersons for a moment,
Mhm.
um, I, I've researched a little bit for this episode, and I happen to have a book right here.
Mhm.
This is Orson Welles. I'd like to read an excerpt from it real quick,
Okay.
and I want to get your take on it because this is a story. This is kind of a moment that fascinates me. This is a quote from Pierre Bogdanovich, writing in the book. In a Beverly Hills hotel suite, Orson was flipping the TV dial as usual when he happened on an early scene from Ambersons. Almost before it was visible, he quickly switched channels, but I noticed it and asked him to leave it on. He loudly refused, but everyone in the room started badgering him to let us see the film. One of the people had never seen it, and finally, exasperated, he turned back to the channel and stalked out of the room.
Hmm.
Now we all felt terrible and called him to come back. He yelled in jokingly that he was going into the quote soundproof room end quote. We watched him for a while, and pretty soon Orson appeared in the doorway, leaning against the door, looking at the TV unhappily. We all pretended not to notice and went on watching the picture. A few minutes went by. Orson casually made his way across the room and sat on the edge of a sofa and looked at the TV intently, but with a desperation combined with a terrible anxiety. The film went on, and Orson loudly announced the loss of certain truncated scenes, excuse me. Several minutes later, he stood up and, turning his back to us, went to the window and began fiddling with the Venetian blinds. The rest of us exchanged looks. We'd all noticed there were tears in his eyes. Then one of us said to Orson cheerfully that we'd best turn it off because it seemed to be upsetting him. He said it wasn't, but he didn't turn back to the room. I switched to another channel, and we started to talk of something else. Orson even Orson eventually joined the conversation, and no one mentioned Ambersons for the rest of the night. Have you read that before? Is there
Yeah.
any okay? So to me, that's just one of the great moments of like, oh my God, this that was the 70s by then. He made Ambersons in the 40s. That it still stuck with him.
Yeah. I mean, it was a, I don't even know how he continued making movies after Ambersons. He seriously considered quitting.
Yeah.
He thought of becoming a teacher, back to the Todd School, or he then began thinking of making educational films because he was very into politics. And in after Ambersons, for a while, he didn't get to direct another movie for a few years. He was campaigning for Roosevelt and doing radio broadcasts on politics and writing a political column. I would have probably quit at that point because he was 27. He just made maybe the greatest movie ever made, and
Yeah.
they just ruined it. Um, it was, people see him as a failure, but the theme of my book, Whatever Happened to Orson Welles, I borrowed from my Madison Film Mafia friend, Douglas Gomery, film historian. He said Welles is generally seen as a failed studio director, but it's more enlightening to see him as a director who briefly had the resources of a major studio, but was always an independent filmmaker at heart. And he eventually, once he was expelled from the studios, he went to Europe and became a complete independent filmmaker. And Truffaut said Welles, when he went to Europe, fulfilled his destiny as an avant-garde filmmaker. That's another good way to put it. And by the 70s, he was totally independent. He was making films with his own money, he and Oya, and he was just shooting films at his own home movies, literally. And he turned down some offers from studios. He didn't want to work for the studios anymore. And um, that's a good way to look at his career, that he was briefly working for, big studios, but he was not at heart a Hollywood person, and Robert Wise, I think the reason Wise actually thought they were trying to help this film succeed is the difference is Wise was a Hollywood guy at heart, and he thought in those terms like please the audience and make the film showable, whereas Welles was an artist. And Jean Renoir had probably the key line. He said Welles was an aristocrat who worked in a popular media.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a great comment, that he was in the wrong medium he was very happy in the theater and he was happy in the radio. But film is this medium where, as he said, you need hundreds of thousands of dollars and a big crew and everything to make a big film. And directors don't have the independence that a theater director would. I mean, when he did the Julius Caesar celebrated stage production in 1937, it cost $12,000. That's all it cost. Could you imagine? So he had complete control of that, and he was a radio star, and he made money, and he funneled the radio money into his plays, and um, some of the plays were done for the WPA, Federal Theater, and he said, I'm the only person who ever illegally put his own money into a federal government project. Yeah. But his late in life, his first wife, Virginia, said, you would have been happier staying in the theater, and Wells agreed with her. I heard this from his daughter, Chris Wells Fetter. And Wells thought, yeah, I would have had an easier life, and I would have, done a lot of work in the theater. But he said, he fell in love with movies, and he said, I fell in love with the most expensive mistress a man can ever have, and it was an intoxicating thing. Frank Capra said filmmaking is like heroin; it becomes like an addiction. But that was Wells's thing. He was kind of miscast as a big feature filmmaker, but he wound up making films his own way with his own money, so he had control. The downside was a lot of them didn't get finished or ran into problems, and he gets attacked for that by people who don't really understand. So I was trying to explain in my book why I said that every unfinished Wells film has different reasons for being unfinished. Some of them get completed, Other Side of the Wind, it took us 48 years to get it completed. And the Munich Film Museum has most of Wells's unfinished work, and Stefan Drossler has put together short versions of films like The Dreamers and Orson Welles' Magic Show and Merchant of Venice and other projects that were unfinished. And the one big Welles film that still needs to be completed by somebody is Don Quixote, which he worked on for decades. And the footage is in Europe, and the problem is these films have a lot of legal issues connected with them, and as well as aesthetic issues. And as I say in my book, somebody should come along and spend 48 years finishing Don Quixote, but I don't have the time myself to do that. I spent 48 years working on the Other Side of the Wind, but I don't have another 48 years.
Are there any final thoughts you can share with us about Magnificent Ambersons or your upcoming book?
Well, yeah, I just wish, if you look at Robert Carringer's book on Ambersons that came out in the 90s, it's got a negative introduction, which is strange. Both Kane and Ambersons, when the scripts were published, both of them had negative introductions, which is kind of crazy.
Wow.
He's criticizing Wells a lot and saying that a lot of the problems the film had were stemming from Wells's script, and I don't agree with that. But in that book, he has the cutting continuity, and you can read exactly what all the shots and dialogue were supposed to be. So if you don't have the way of seeing Roger Ryan's film that I told you about, his reconstruction, you could read that and see what Wells intended and why it would have been such a different and great film. I'll mention that to you. Actually, in my 1968 book, Persistence of Vision, the first book I published, I wrote a long piece on Ambersons in which I did the first verbal reconstruction, in quotes, with using the shooting script, and I wrote about, analyze what the film would have been and all that. And to me, that's the best piece of film criticism I've written. I rewrote it in the 90s. I redid the Wells book and I did some revising on it. And by then I had the cutting continuity that I'm referring to that Carringer printed. And so I was able to be much more precise about what the film contained because the shooting script had been modified by Wells, So anyway, I did that long essay on Ambersons and what it could have been. I would recommend people read that if you want to know what the film was like. That's my Orson Welles 1996 edition, which is out of print, but you can get copies online. And I did on the Ambersons Blu-ray for Criterion.
Yes.
I did a half-hour interview on there. They asked me to talk about how the film was different, why it was cut, what happened with Welles at RKO, and I told, stories about how they lied to him about the budget and they fired him from It's All True, and Ambersons got mutilated in the process. And Roger Ryan very graciously supplied some additional stills that he keeps finding more frame enlargements from the film, and he's got, he let me use quite a number of stills from missing scenes. The ending of the film, I saw the last shot. Peter Bogdanovich in 1970, when I went to visit him for the first time, um, he was working on that book that you were holding up there, This is Orson Welles, and he had these file cabinets, and he had a folder full of frame enlargements from the scenes that were cut from Ambersons, and he showed me the last shot, which was this fascinating overhead long shot of Eugene's little car driving off through these big, huge buildings in Indianapolis. The city had grown up around them, and he was leaving the boarding house where he'd seen Agnes Moorehead for the last time. And in the background, you see an elevated train going across the horizon, and you see black smoke is sort of billowing throughout the frame. It's kind of a hellish modern landscape. And I saw this shot, and I said to Peter, where did you get this? And he just sort of wiggled his eyebrows. He had like what I remember is maybe 40 or 50 or 60 frame enlargements. So anyway, in the 90s, when I did my revised version of the book, I wanted to use that frame enlargement. And I checked, Indiana University has Peter's papers and Welles's papers, and they don't have that frame enlargement. They have other ones, only about 7, I think. And I called Peter and I said, what happened to that frame enlargement? And he said, well, I said, where did you get it? And this time he said, Orson had them made. Apparently, according to Roger Ryan, when Welles was in Rio in March of 42, when they were in post-production, he asked for frame enlargements to be sent down to him, and that's why he had these. And then Peter borrowed them from Orson. And I said, what happened to it? And he said, he had a dispute with Welles about the interview book, and he turned over all his material to Welles and Oya Kodar, who inherited all the material. And then she hired Jonathan Rosenbaum to edit the book together, and it took a long time. But apparently, I tried to trace what happened to this frame enlargement. Oya had put a lot of boxes from that material that Peter gave her into a storage facility under a freeway in Los Angeles. And her nephew, Sasha, who is rumored to be Welles's son, he calls himself Sasha Welles. He and his friends stored their surfboards in this storage facility under a freeway, and they left it unlocked. And somebody broke in and stole a lot of the boxes. And apparently, the box with the frame enlargements got stolen. So all that exists of that is my drawing of that, which
Which is on the Criterion Blu-ray.
It's on the Criterion Blu-ray. I was just going to say I could call it up, but it would take a while. But it's on the Blu-ray. I did a drawing on it based on memory, and pretty accurate memory, I think, of what the last shot looked like. And so I think the only people maybe who've seen this thing are me and Oya, probably, who are still alive. And that's the ending of the film. It also ran in the British magazine Empire. So look at that shot. But I did a kind of, it's kind of short, but a 30-minute version of what happened in this great film. And it's similar to what we've been talking about, but you're asking a lot of good questions that go deeper than what I was able to do on this short interview on the Criterion Blu-ray. But I'm glad to be part of that. I just wish they had run Roger's whole thing. Maybe someday Roger's film will see the light of day.
I'm doing my best.
Yeah.
So I'll ask you one more question. When and where can listeners purchase your book?
Oh, yes. Well, on November 21st, we're taping this ahead of time. November 21st is the publication day, and it'll be available on the Sticking Place Books website just type in Google Sticking Place Books, and that's Paul Cronin's website for his wonderful new company, and it has this whole series of books by various film historians and other interesting books by filmmakers. And you can buy the book. You get a big discount if you buy it through the website. You can also buy it through Amazon, but if you go through the Sticking Place Books, you get a major discount either on the hardcover or the paperback. It's a big book. It's 700 odd pages, but I think people will have a good time reading it. I try to make it as entertaining as possible. It's full of stories and kind of bittersweet, but a lot of humor in the book. And it's kind of, there's a lot that I keep thinking of things. Geez, I wish I put this in. I wish I put that in. But you have to draw an end somewhere. You can't just keep going on. But anyway, I think people will have fun reading it. That's the way to get the book as of November 21st.
I'll include that in the show notes as well. A link to the to Sticking Place as well as the Amazon links.
Thank you.
So listeners, please look out for that. Joe McBride, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you, and I hope to talk again soon.
Well, thank you, Andrew. It's always wonderful to talk to you, and you ask such great questions. And it's great we have this friendship and background as teacher and student. That's really informed our discussion on a number of topics this time. So that I love talking to you about all these subjects. So thank you so much for taking the time with me.
No need to thank me. It's the thrill of a lifetime.
Well, it's such a kick to be with you. Thank you.